Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for June 2, 2022, the Sandberg Steps Down edition. And we begin with that story as Sheryl Sandberg, the Chief Operating Officer at Facebook's parent Meta, has resigned her position, stepping down after 14 years as the company continues to face questions on its metaverse and various other issues. She is leaving Meta this fall, but plans to continue serving on the board of directors. She said it's time for her to write the next chapter of her life. In an interesting story from the Financial Times, Iranian anger at corruption intensifies after a fatal building collapse. A Metropole Twin Towers complex collapsed in the Iranian city of Abadan, and the building's developer was one of its 32 victims. But it's not been enough to convince those who've taken to the streets to protest against corruption. Deeply suspicious of the official narrative, they believe influential backers have actually helped him to flee the country. The corruption in Iran has reached really academic proportions, and not only has the country lost its natural wealth, but new development projects have been benefiting the corrupt. So corruption in Iran, you might think they would do a little bit better than that, but apparently not. Next up from Reuters, SPACs continue to be less favored, largely because of SEC rules that, among other things, require warnings on the use of projections. SPACs previously relied liberally on what can only be thought of as very rainy day projections. And now the SEC is intimating that bankers and others involved with SPACs from an early stage could be punished if the published forecasts don't pan out. Of course, that's how SPACs in large part garnered their money, was through really just incredibly rosy projections. And they claimed that because they were not subject to SEC regulations, they didn't have to follow the laws, or rules rather, that everyone else did. And our final story comes to us from the Houston Chronicle, as IBM was found to have engaged in fraud against the Houston-based company BMC Software. A U.S. district judge ruled after a bench trial that during contract negotiations with BMC, IBM made material representations that it would not displace BMC's products from people or companies that they were both working with. BMC was both a competitor to and a subcontractor to IBM, and IBM apparently pulled the wool over their eyes through fraudulent mechanisms and lost big in a bench trial. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.